Hello, everybody, and welcome to a very special episode of The Best Games, period. I am your host, Jack Gardner, and with me this week is the wonderful and very elusive Naomi Lugo.
And alive! Hi, everyone, I'm alive!
I found her just wandering out back.
Yeah. It's just looking at the sky, just kind of mumbling. Jack took me back to the safety of the Best Games period, so I'm back.
Yeah, I think you were living in a van down by the river.
No, my beautiful people. I've just been gone for a little bit getting this whole life thing sorted out. Moved into a house, got 2 little tiny baby kittens. Yeah, those are my excuses. Forgive me.
No, life is hard, and we get it. And I will hold down the fort whenever you have to go, and hopefully someone will hold down the fort for me when I have to go. Yes. I don't know. Who can hold the fort? Also, that's a really weird phrase now that I'm thinking about it.
Who can hold the fort?
Why would you hold a fort down?
How so it doesn't would one walk do away. That?
What are the logistics? Answer me.
Tent poles. Architects. No, tent stakes. You just get a bunch of tent stakes and put them on the corners of your fort.
Look, I don't know how you get stakes out of tents. They're very flat. Nothing like cows.
Nope. They're lean steaks.
I guess technically they'd be vegan steaks. I've missed this. This is actually, I think it's been a very long time since we did an episode along these lines.
Yeah. I think the last, solid podcast wasn't even, a Best Games period. It was, E3 or something.
Yeah, I mean, the
last one you were
on, you mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
The last one you were on released in, I think, the summer of last year.
Hey. At least it hasn't been a whole year.
We talked about D&D.
Yeah, that's right. Plug for the D&D episode. Go listen to that bad boy.
Also, it has been over a year since you received the last Women and Tropes and Games episode. But you know what?
We didn't forget about it.
I mean, I think I did for a while. But you know what? We're back, and this is episode 3. We're going to be taking a little looky look at the third part of Anita Sarkeesian's Tropes versus Women in Video Games series on YouTube that she put together so many years ago now to help provide a basic primer in feminist theory as applied to video games. And at the time, it was totally non-controversial and everything was fine.
A fiery little discussion that was had across the video game internet. But now, in the beautiful year of 2020, we're able to look at these things and be like, oh yeah, that wasn't a big deal.
I mean, okay.
As much of a big deal as it shouldn't have been, I should clarify. It's definitely still a big deal.
Yeah, it's still a big deal. I still feel like anytime she posts anything on the internet, people get angry.
Oh my gosh, that poor woman.
And also, you still can't, write an article about, hey, maybe there should be more women in video games, without getting a bunch of toxic, angry people in your comment section. But, all that being said, this particular video series has kind of cooled off a little bit, enough for us to talk about it in a bit more detail. I think in the spirit in which this series was intended, kicking off conversations and kind of allowing us to dig into the ideas that are being presented and, whether we agree or disagree, have a meaningful and productive discussion.
Exactly. That's the part what I meant. That shouldn't be a big deal, but
right.
Whatever. We're here now.
You mean adult conversations?
Yes. So this episode was a continuation of the other two pretty much, where we're looking at the damsel in distress again, but we're doing another branch of it. And you want to describe to the lovely people what branch we're looking at today?
Yeah, well, first, the damsel in distress trope is, like, you can listen to our first 2 episodes. We go over it in a lot of detail, but to sum up for this one, to people who might be totally out of the loop about what the Women in Tropes and Games series is about. The damsel in distress trope is a classic device used in video games to kind of kick off the journey of the game. It is Bowser kidnapping Princess Peach and taking her to his castle, leaving Mario to rescue her. And that is this kind of blueprint we've seen in countless games across all of time up until now. And this particular episode looks at not the origins of the trope or the many permutations of the trope, but the way that people try and get around using the trope while still using the trope. Mm-hmm. And for those of you listening, a trope is just a narrative device. It is a narrative it is a narrative device that has been used so many times that it has become a cliche, and you can kind of be like, oh, that's that thing that I've seen in other things.
Yeah, so, exactly. It's very familiar at this point, to say the least.
Right. It's kind of like when you're watching like a very cheap knockoff movie, and you find yourself knowing what's going to happen before it happens in the movie. That's because you have everyone has kind of this innate ability to recognize these tropes. We just don't usually point at each specific trope and say, oh, that is the blah trope, that is the other blah trope. Instead, we tend to just kind of subconsciously process them and use that. So in this particular episode of Tropes versus Women in Video Games, we are first looking at reversed damseling, mm-hmm. which is when instead of the woman being abducted, it is the man being abducted and the woman being the one who has to go off and save her hunky monkey. I was trying to think of something that rhymed with monkey, with hunky, and
no, you
monkey
did an
was the
excellent
best
job.
I could do.
You did excellent.
Yeah, so what did you kind of think of these, this particular examination for the first part of the video?
Yeah, so it's honestly something I didn't think about at first, right? And that's why these things exist. But it's supposed to be this role reversal, right? Oh, look, we have damsels in distress, but hey, there's a dude in distress. Isn't that funny? And I guess I never really thought about it because, it's so ingrained in my mind and in our vast mind, our hive mind, that damsels are women. They're weak and they need someone to rescue them. So if we put it on a man, then it's gonna be fine, And all of those jokes to me, and that's exactly what they turn into, is jokes. And then I guess we'll start talking about why that's a problem. But I don't know, I just always rolled my eyes and thought it was lazy and never really looked at it as an issue per se. But looking at the way she breaks down each individual case, it definitely makes me pause and be like, cool. I didn't realize that this is what that meant.
Yeah, part of what I think is really great about this video series is that it is encouraging people to kind of question these tropes and, really get down to the nitty gritty of what these tropes are saying in a narrative sense. So like,
exactly, like, you know, oh yeah, it's super hilarious that they're rescuing a guy, but never really looked at why is that supposed to be super hilarious. And I guess that's like the very boiled down point of this video, is to look at what we're saying when we're saying that only men can be the protagonist. And like the big chunk of this video was looking at, you know, why can't we have Zelda as the protagonist, and someone doing a code change and making it Zelda instead of Link. And I don't know, I'm at the point in this 3 parts of the bigger series is like, it is just so beyond frustrating that we've had an archetype for our protagonist for so long and still do. I'm just weary, you know? And seeing that women are just exchanged for a joke is just, I don't know. I guess,
well, so
I need to take a deep sigh.
Yeah.
I'll I'm just becoming jumbled in my anger. And I guess, I guess I want to look at what makes it, you know, what makes me so flustered. And it's, you know, being deprived of all of these moments that have been special to people. You know, I look at my husband, and he has these extreme draws to certain characters because they meant really, really personal things to him at their points. And it's because, you know, he was able to see himself in these characters because they look like him. And that's not his fault, you know, that's a good thing. But we've needed representation for so many people for so long. It's just, it's sad.
Yeah.
But it's a conversation that we definitely needed to have.
Yeah, like that's part of kind of what makes the tropiness of this kind of insidious, because part of the problem of the damsel in distress trope isn't necessarily that these individual games taken by themselves would have you know, detrimental effects on people playing, but it is the cumulative effect of all of these games. You know, what is the cumulative effect when only 4% of the games you're playing are have female protagonists?
Yeah, it's a literal coded language saying that video games are not for you, you know, and that's, I guess that's one of the bigger points that it boils down to for me. You know, when I was growing up, video games weren't for me. The only reason I got to play video games, you know, when I was younger was when my brothers came of age and they got a console. And that sucks, you know. And looking back and not really having a character that I really bonded with back in those days, you know, because I saw them in me, that sucks too. And, you know, it might sound like, wah, poor me, but this is a problem that has gone across for all, I mean, not only women, but people of color. You know, we have a majority of white male protagonists in our games, and women pushed to the side and people of color used for other things. And, you know, yeah, I'm getting all flustered again, but basically, you know, these things are really important, and people wouldn't have had such a huge uproar and backlash against such a simple idea if it weren't so important.
Right. Right.
And that's why we have to look at these things and look at individual cases and dissect them and look at how it contributes to the whole, you know. On its own, God of War is a great series, you know, it's fun, and the latest game was absolutely amazing. But at the same time, we have to look at how it contributed to violence in video games in general. And that's fine. Video games don't escape the, you know, the rules like other mediums do. No medium escapes the rules, sorry. What I mean is, you know, we look at movies this way, we need to look at our games this way, and I can't believe that in 2020 we're starting to do this.
Yeah, and so to kind of get back to the reverse trope in particular, and you kind of touched on this, but the reason the reverse trope isn't problematic, while the reverse damsel isn't as problematic as the woman in distress, as the damsel in distress, rather, is because the cumulative effort isn't there when it comes to the reversed damseling. So, like, there is not a common trope in our stories and narratives about a man being kidnapped and being unable to escape, and needing a woman to come rescue him. That isn't a common thing in games. It's not a terribly common thing in other mediums, except maybe like the romance genre of novels. But I don't have a ton of experience with those and can't really speak to that. I'm just saying, like, there's not the way that things get made in the vast majority of industries assumes a male perspective. And so in that line, the reversed damsel, the man who is unable to escape, is funny because it is emasculating that male character. Mm-hmm. It is subverting your expectations in a way that goes against the common grain of the trope that you're expecting, and it's funny, ha, because a woman is weak and can't escape, and the man is now weak and can't escape.
Mm-hmm. And I'm going to steal your word from before. It becomes insidious because it just validates all of those kind of underlying cultural and societal conditionings that, yeah, it is funny when a man is emasculated. And this is super emasculating. Men shouldn't need women, all of that stuff. So...
And I just think that, like, when it comes to this in particular, we cannot emphasize enough that we are not saying that you play a game of Super Mario Brothers and you have suddenly been indoctrinated to believe that women are weak and incapable of adventuring.
Thanks for supporting the patriarchy.
That's not what we're saying at all. It is, again, the cumulative effect of all of these games existing with this same trope, and what that message is that kind of reinforces over and over, and that can be especially harmful when that is combined with real world consequences. Like, for women, for example, who are perceived as weaker and more vulnerable. And what does that do to women?
Yeah.
It puts them in situations where the people around them expect them to be weak and vulnerable.
Exactly. And
like
I want to make...
your parents, like, raise you with that perspective in mind. And that can lead to a whole host of problems.
Exactly. And I want to make a really big point, too, in saying that recognizing these things, you know, they might have done their damage already at, you know, whatever perspective you want to take. These are older games, you know, all of that, you know, we're always progressing. Games are going to get better, blah, blah, blah. But it is so important to hear these things out loud and talk about them, because it doesn't just become another thing that the people affected have to just kind of push down in their brains. And I'll get a little bit more clear. So something like, okay, I'm gonna do a setup and go on a little bit of a tangent here. So
okay.
Buckle
I'll
your
try and
seatbelts.
bear with you.
So Dan Harmon, creator, Rick and Morty, Community, all of that, he was accused of sexual harassment in his workplace the show leader for Community when that was happening. He was accused of harassing one of his writers, and that was about 6 years ago or something like that when Community ended.
It's been a long time.
Yes. So I told you I was taking you on a ride. This is a very specific ride.
I just love Community over that so much.
Time,
it's so old.
Yeah, but go back to Community days. And that's kind of a common story that's been coming out, right, with the Me Too movement and everything. But with Dan Harmon, why I wanted to bring up his case is something different happened, right? So over the case of these 6 years, he kind of did the unfortunately typical thing where it became defensive, said, oh, I have no idea what I was doing. I'm so sorry that I might have been inappropriate. That very
sorry
generic,
if I offended anybody.
Yes, that very generic, open apology. He kind of started out like that, talking indirectly to this woman via Twitter or his podcast, and that was his apology, right? Not very direct, not for her, not really for anyone. But I think it was, obviously a lot more recently. He went on to another show and came back with a very, very sincere, amazing apology. And I'll have to send a link over to Jack so we can link this for the episode. But in the course of his apology, he detailed exactly what he did to this woman in bigger terms. He said that once he told her that he liked her, she rejected him. So he made it his job to make her life hell. And he admitted to very specific things that he did to her. And unfortunately in the case of Me Too, it wasn't, at the highest end of the spectrum where he was physically abusing her. But he said the specific things that he did to her and that he knew he was doing to her in these very passive-aggressive ways. And she was able to get so much healing. And there was an interview that they did with her where she described how she felt about this apology because it was so different from all of the others. And it was the only time that we've had basically a documentation of someone accepting apology in this situation. But basically he outlined what he did, described why he did it in a very honest sense. He said, I knew I could get away with this, so I did it. He said very specific things, and she was able to get healing because she was validated. It wasn't, oh, maybe your boss is just being extra nice to you because you're a good writer, or, this is just how things go in the industry. Maybe you just interpreted it wrong. No, she got validation on exactly how she felt. She knew exactly what was happening, and so did he. Yeah. Exactly. And so that was a real moment of apology and growth, I think. And the reason I say all of that is what's the
connection? Bring us home.
Is to just really hammer in the point that talking about these things, obviously we're not going to get an apology from every single dev. Some of these things are dumb. They don't need apologies. We don't necessarily need apologies from devs for, extra boob jiggle or something like that. But it is so important to talk about these specific things, these specific microaggressions. I mean, that's kind of what they are. It's validating to the women who have had to experience these things in their media. So I just wanted to say all of that to just drive home why we're talking about this show from 2013.
Yeah, so part of what you said there, with, especially when it comes to microaggressions, just to kind of bring this in, is that when it comes to gaming, when it comes to media, you don't necessarily need to explicitly have a character look into the camera and say, this is not for you. Because we're human beings. We're really smart. We can read media. We can understand it on an instinctual level. And so there are many subtle ways that games can communicate, this is not for you.
And in ways that they don't even notice. I just want to put that in there.
Right. And so on the one hand, you have games that are oh, well, the main character is a man because men are more capable, and when you see that, and it is in every single game, and again, a lot of these a lot of these tropes are rooted in classic, 18 or 16-bit or 8-bit games, and the modern era has a lot of nostalgia for those early games, and so these tropes just get recycled. And so when you see those over and over and over again, and on top of that, the advertising, especially in the 80s and 90s, was geared towards getting men, boys, into the gaming ecosystem. It was not oriented towards getting women to game. Recently I wrote an article about this very phenomenon. It's for Women's History Month. And originally, this is super interesting. Originally, women were the ones who were more adept at programming than men. And that's because before mechanical computers, you had things that were called computers, but those were jobs that people did. And because they were a very low prestige job, around World War II, a lot of women entered the workforce to become computers.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense.
Their job would be to do complex equations. So, like, if you were really good at math, you could become a computer. And so when mechanical computers came onto the scene, what was associated with manliness was the hardware. And programming was seen as kind of the feminine. It was not as important, it was not as flashy, and so it made sense that the people who were formerly computers would go to programming these new computers. And that's why the first video game, well, let me put it this way. So you had this workforce of people in gaming. And actually, at the time, there was a time when the majority of people who were entering programming courses were women. And then somewhere in the 70s, late 60s, early 70s, there was a shift. And basically, during that shift, programming became perceived as more prestigious. And men started creating men's clubs around programming, men's club or associations around that, professional organizations. Colleges stopped offering programming degrees to women.
Oh my goodness.
There were all these little systemic blockages that prevented women from going into programming. And so by the time the 80s rolled around, programming in general was seen as a male thing. So that carried over into video games too. So the reason that in the 80s and 90s advertising was geared towards men and boys was because that perception had kind of pervaded the professional space. And to this day, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done.
Because once you build those systems up, they're systems, it's systemic problems. It's not something where we can just hire a bunch of women and it's fixed. It's a complicated problem that they created because of that. So
well, and it's unfortunate because there's a lot of really valuable things that women have contributed over the years. For example, the first game that had a narrative at all was created by a woman.
No.
Yeah, it's called the
Women
Sumerian
can't do that,
game.
though. We need rescuing.
Yeah. No. So there are just all of these stories that are super interesting that we just don't get because our industry has been locked into this one mindset, into over-reliance on these certain narrative beats and narrative quirks that have become so ingrained that they are cliche. And that's why the reverse trope kind of came to be, because, oh, you can't just have another game where a knight rescues a princess from a tower. You gotta, maybe this time the princess rescues the knight from the tower.
And it'll be hilarious.
Or it will just be something different. It doesn't even have to be hilarious.
Yes, but unfortunately, some of the games make it explicitly hilarious, but,
I mean, we, specifically in the video, Anita Sarkeesian talks about Super Princess Peach, a game from 2006 on the DS, which, again, this is an example of how you can be trying to subvert a trope and stumble into...
That's a good way to put it.
A completely different and still problematic trope.
They just fell into it.
Or stereotypes. So, yeah, basically in the game, Princess Peach has to rescue Mario. It's the first and only game to star Peach as a solo thing.
And it's on the DS.
And her powers are all basically they all basically derive from her having mood swings. And the quote that I wrote down here in my notes is, Nintendo has turned a PMS joke into their core gameplay mechanic. And that's basically true.
That's exactly what they did. Literally.
She can get so angry and throw a tantrum that she blows up stuff. She can cry so hard that it affects the environment.
Can you imagine if we actually had those powers? That'd be amazing. But offensive, Nintendo.
But then even with that kind of framing, the story in the game focuses on her parasol, who is a cursed boy. So
it's not really even Peach.
It's not even about Princess Peach. So, basically what we're getting at here is, you can try and subvert the trope. That's fine. But the subversion of a trope doesn't really work when you're using that to make fun of women. Or, in this particular case, there are other tropes that don't involve women. Anyway, you get what I'm saying.
Yes. And then another small example / tangent. We've had this marketing since the 80s, and a system that has weeded out women from programming, like Jack described. So then we have problems like this because we have a male-dominated culture within the video games industry, especially at that time. And then, male-dominated development teams, and then we make games like this, and it just becomes a cycle. So there's another instance of it affecting women in the real world.
I just have to emphasize at every turn here that this is not about men being evil or feeling like they have to go out of their way to stick it to these women.
It's consequential.
Yeah, the problem isn't that they have any malice towards women most of the time. The problem is just that there isn't another voice in the room or segment of voices in the room making decisions that matter that can say, wait a minute.
Let's not. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Just wait a minute. That's all, really.
Right.
And that's why it becomes so frustrating. It
rolls over into all kinds of other things too. For example, there is I totally just had a mind blank. As part of this article that I wrote, there's a got it. There we go. So for example, there's Muriel Trami. I don't know how to pronounce her last name. Very sorry. But basically, Muriel is one of the only creative black leads of a game that I could find, who is black and a woman.
Mm-hmm.
And that's insane. But it's also why, like, the vast majority of games do not reflect that experience.
Mm-hmm.
And not having any input from these people at high levels in given organizations means we just don't get stories from those perspectives. We don't get, or if we do, they're flawed and they're incomplete, and much more easily stumble into those problematic stereotypes because you don't have other people in the room giving that vital input. And she wrote some of the most fascinating adventure games of all time. She worked for a company called Cocktail Vision, which was based in Paris, and she created her first game, I think, was Muilo.
Sounds good to me.
French is not my forte, but basically this game was about playing a paranormal investigator in a doomed city, trying to get to the bottom of a bunch of hauntings that were based on real French Caribbean legends about pots of gold, which came from actual history of the French Caribbean being heavily involved in the slave trade. And when slave revolts broke out, plantation owners would take their most loyal slaves into the woods and kill them after they buried their treasure, which made them haunted. And so, like, her being able to draw on all of this experience and all of this this unique perspective created one of the most interesting games of all time. And, like, she's so singular, and that's so sad because we could be getting games like that all the time with these interesting premises and these rich histories and full of these interesting perspectives, and we just don't. And that's part exactly of why we criticize these things.
It's not to shake our fingers and be like, oh, you bad men. No, it's so we can grow and so we can get these stories that are so, invaluable and amazing. And really what games should be about, and that's telling everybody's story, just like every other medium.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that kind of brings us to the part in the video where she talks about how there's not an equivalence. We kind of touched on this, but there's not an equivalence between showing a man on screen in a given role and showing a woman on screen in that same role. Like, the context around each of those characters is very different because we live in the real world.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. It's why Lara Croft is not equivalent to Nathan Drake. I love Lara Croft, and I love that I got to play as a woman adventurer, but yeah, it becomes more complicated after that.
Yeah, there's that, and like just slapping a female character model onto a male model, or vice versa, doesn't...
Or pink bow. The pink bows are nice.
Yeah, the pink bow. Doesn't change the fundamental dynamic that is the problem. Especially, she only touches on this lightly, but like, if your character... And I think this is just a good rule of thumb for game developers in general, but if your woman character could just be replaced by a shiny doohickey or a dog, like, her being a person and a woman is just to be valuable, then you probably shouldn't just put something else valuable there. You don't need to have it be a human woman. That sends a weird message.
Very weird.
And the other part is, like, just reversing the trope isn't enough to really subvert it in any interesting way.
No, because it takes all of the parts of the trope itself. And like you said, it's not equivalent, you know? We might have this, what did you call it? Hunky monkey over here that we need to rescue. But, you know, looking at a half-naked male video game sprite is going to be so different than looking at the female one with the boob jiggle animation. You know, and like you said, we're in the real world, so it's going to have a different weight to different people.
Right.
And unfortunately, as a woman looking at that, it's you know, dehumanizing. And then it is for the man as well, but in a different way.
It's more dehumanizing because women are often only valued for their looks.
Mm-hmm. And it's dehumanizing for the man because they're equated to a woman or a dog.
Right. So let's see. Where are we in my notes?
We're pretty much towards the end.
I mean,
of the video wise.
Yeah, like a lot of she gives a lot of examples that were modern for the time. So games like Castle Crashers, Super Meat Boy, Hotline Miami, Gunman Clive, Guacamelee, and a whole lot more. Like, she is trying to kind of quash the argument that, like, oh, we can look to indie games to kind of like save us from these tropes. And the answer and what she's trying to get across is that we can't necessarily, because all of these games are building off of these retro foundations that themselves were built off of these problematic tropes. And so we have to do more if we want to start telling new and better stories.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, she's really good at giving examples, because at the end of the video, you know, she gives examples of games that are doing these things, you know, and she doesn't say, look, these are perfect games that are, you know, we should celebrate. No, she looks at the mechanics that specifically tackle these things and saying, look, it can be done and we've done it. It's innovative.
I had a question. Mm-hmm. Like, she's talking about, like, these games. The video is obviously made in, like, 2012, 2013. Do you think that this is still true? Are indie games still kind of stuck in this, specifically when it comes to this trope?
I don't think as widely, no. Because, you know, we did have kind of a resurgence era then, where we were seeing a lot of these indie kind of homages to older games popping up. I think we've kind of come to a point where we have a lot wider of wide, not whiter, by the way, wide, or wider appeal for devs to start their games. Maybe I'm just being altruistic, but I've seen a lot more games that tackle a lot more topics in innovative ways. I think that, and this might, again, of course it's going to be a generalization, but, you know, a big appeal of indie development is to be able to innovate and do something new. And I feel like indie devs are taking that and going with it. Of course, there's still going to be games who, you know, use these tropes. That's just always going to happen. But I think we are pushing forward. And I wish I could think of, you know, perfect examples of this. I mean, but
I know that I consider Transistor. Wow.
Yeah.
I don't think either of us can speak tonight.
No, we can't.
We're recording very late. But Transistor is a great example. It came out only a year after. It's like 6 years old. Gosh, we're old. But that's a game about a woman who has her voice stolen from her, and instead of dying to fuel a man's revenge rampage, she's the one who survives, and she decides that she's going to take revenge. And maybe to some extent that this is like a reverse trope. But it kind of is subversive in the fact that her partner isn't really dead. I don't know. It's
okay.
I consider it a very Shakespearean game.
Yeah, I think we have a lot more platforms for devs. You know, we have like itch.io, you know, and these other like self-publishing platforms where we can specifically look up, you know, like LGBT games and get that representation. But I'll look at like, you know, something more mainstream in the indie world, right? Like Stardew Valley, right? You can make your own character. You're kind of a silent protagonist. And there definitely are some old game tropes in there. But you know, what I think the developer did a really good job at was, you know, yes, you trade in your items for affection. You know, you give them gifts, and that's very, you know, it's kind of it's a mechanic driven kind of plot device. You know, you give each character their specific presents, and if you give them enough presents, they'll love you, all that stuff. But I think where he was able to kind of, you know, I'm trying to think of a better word than rein it in, because I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing or a mechanic. It's just an example. But he, and what I mean, he is Eric Barone, the developer. He was able to create complex characters behind this mechanic. You know, you give a certain character their favorite treat, and then you'll start unlocking their friendship levels, and at certain friendship levels you'll get cutscenes and you'll get an insight into that person's life. And I thought that was really amazing. You know, it wasn't just a cost benefit thing. Now you have a wife and now you can make more crops. It's, you get another part of this game where you get to interact with the characters around town and get to learn about them and get to, you know, understand someone else's perspective. And like one of the characters was a you know, an alcoholic, and I think he did a really good job of making a well-rounded character there. Or one of them was, I think her name was Marnie, and she's like a small town scientist, biracial girl, and she's going through these things, and all she wants to do is create this wonderful, it's like a completely different storyline, right? So I think developers have been doing a good job in growing and pushing these boundaries. Like we've seen games like Celeste, where it's all about mental illness, but it is paying an homage to these old games. You know, there's so many things that can be done, and I think that's what's important is, you know, these damsel in distress is not only damaging to women, but it's damaging to video game culture, I would say, where if we just rely on these tropes, we just get the same games over and over. And we've seen that in TV and video and movies, and we don't want that, right? So it only makes sense to me to want to explore other stories.
Yeah, it just makes games more boring when you box them in like this. So I think that brings us to the section of the video that is about sexism as a joke, which kind of ties into haha, that man is damseled. Like she kind of makes this comparison. As long as the sexism is over the top, it's not a problem. As long as it is clearly hyperbolic, then it's funny, right? Like, if I do this thing but go way overboard, then it's funny, right? And if it's funny, then it's not bad.
Then it, you know, quote, parody, unquote. But if it's not really taking that next step to become parody, then it's just the same thing.
Right. Like, if the subject of the joke is women, and you don't do anything with that and just let that sit, then you just made fun of women. You just did it a lot. You're
just like, look at this joke, isn't it funny? Pretty much.
Or look at this joke, isn't it awful?
Yeah, that's, yep.
Like,
isn't it so bad?
I feel like a lot of people have friends that fall into that category that will make jokes like that.
Yeah, like, that's definitely YouTube era.
I definitely had a friend at one point who thought it was super funny to just be very racist. And it was so uncomfortable and awful. And I think, honestly, he was working through some stuff himself and was surrounded by not great people.
Yeah.
But that's why I kind of, like, understand where this, like, ironic sexism as a point comes from. Because I think of my friend who would just be, like, quoting Anchorman.
Mm-hmm.
And, like, there's nothing wrong with quoting Anchorman, but when you keep doing it a lot and then just start making jokes at the expense of women a lot and keep going, there's a certain point where it's just like, oh, you're just making fun of women. You're not being clever here anymore. You're just replicating this awful thing. And that's kind of where this trope in video games is as well.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
And yeah, I don't want to go too far into that, but
this whole series is just designed to get our blood pressure up, I think.
I mean, like,
but in the best way.
I feel bad for people who get trapped in that loop and that mindset, because to them, they think they're being funny. They think they're being clever. And the reality of it is that they are recognizing that something is a problem, which is good. And then instead of doing anything to improve on that problem or fix that problem, instead they are just replicating it and then calling it a joke.
Mm-hmm. Basically putting more of that energy out into the universe without really understanding it.
Well, it is... They confuse comedy and subversion. Like, they think that they are undermining these stereotypes or tropes, but instead they are just spreading them. Mm-hmm. And so that is also can be true about harmful tropes in video games. And the example that Sarkeesian gives is Earthworm Jim. The developers of that game recognized that there was a recurring trope of damsel in distress. They called her Princess What's-Her-Name because it didn't really matter what her name was. The joke is entirely built upon noticing that this trope exists and then recreating it anyway instead of trying to do something interesting with it. Mm-hmm. And also, they just kill her at the very end of the game with a cow. Like, the comedy there comes at the woman's expense. Like, she's not given a real name, she's killed at the end, and, like, it's funny because it flies in the face of your expectations. But it's really sad because that comedy is based upon recognizing these things and doing them anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Like, the woman remains without agency and she dies. Like, I don't know. It's kind of like when you start looking at it through this lens, it makes it less fun. And I think that is part of the major hurdle to getting people to kind of open their eyes to problematic tropes.
Yeah.
Is that once you start seeing that, oh, this could be bad, it's less fun.
Yeah, because then you're a problem and you become part of the problem, and then the natural, response is to be defensive and be like, oh, well, I'm not like that. And that's how, that's a natural reaction. It's understandable.
Yeah, and I think that it's good that in this video she gives an example of a game that does this well, using this trope to have a comedic moment that is satisfying and isn't at the woman's expense. So instead, in The Secret of Monkey Island, Guybrush Threepwood is the plucky protagonist, and he's on a mission to prevent the marriage of Elaine Marley to this murdering pirate. And he arrives at the end just in time to ruin her escape attempt. And she, like, has to come on screen and basically be like, and chew him out. And it's funny. And I'm not saying, and Anita Sarkeesian isn't saying, that every game has to be like that. Because that would turn into just a boring trope. But it's an example of how you can do this right without making the joke at the expense of the woman. And again, if all things were equal, you could make jokes at the expense of women, and you could make jokes at the expense of men. But the problem is, when 4% of your games star women, and you then make jokes at the expense of women, it's not a good look.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
It's the context that really matters. And I think one of the most interesting things here is that Anita Sarkeesian gives a nice and fleshed out example of how to 100% kind of subvert this trope. Because, again, even with the example of The Secret of Monkey Island, it's still not a true subversion of the trope, because the game still stars a man and is about a man. So she gives kind of an example of like, oh, well, this is what something could look like if it were to subvert this damsel in distress trope. And it's like this 1 minute long, animated in kind of a retro aesthetic storyboard, animatic, I guess. Kind of just spelling that out. And it's interesting and fun, and I would play that game, I think. Kind of looks like a Shantae mixed with Mark of the Ninja type game.
Yeah.
I'm down for that. And yeah. I guess, like, I think a good question to end on, there's a long tradition of this trope. And I think that maybe there might be some people kind of thinking like, well, if what you're saying is all true and this trope is harmful, then why are we holding on to it so tightly? Like, even right now, if you go out into like a game marketplace, it could probably any marketplace, you could find a game that relies on a damsel in distress trope relatively quickly. And why is that?
Because we have been doing it. It's a formula, you know? It's a formula that has proven to sell games, at least in the fact that games have been sold. I think that, you know, it is, you know, we keep on saying insidious, and insidious means that it's underground. You don't see how harmful it is until it's there, so it's easy to kind of just ignore it if it doesn't affect you. So I don't think it's a trope that will disappear. I mean, that's kind of the baggage that comes along with tropes, is they're probably going to exist in some form or fashion. But, you know, like Anita was saying, there are ways to still use these formulas, but, you know, add a couple elements that make it do something else. Yeah, I guess that's my response. It's not the most it's pragmatic for me.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that there's a lot of insight into just like, if this thing is hurting us, why do we hold on to it? Mm-hmm. Because we have been holding on to it. Like, it's weird that's like, sometimes the only logic that you really need is like, well, we've been using it forever. Mm-hmm. Why wouldn't we use it? And it's like, well,
if it's broke, don't fix it. All of that mentality. If it's
it's
not broken to you, sure, that
right.
might seem reasonable, but
if you are the one
reach a lot of people. Exactly. So.
It's kind of like oil companies, right? Like, oil companies, there's nothing wrong with oil. Why would you think that? Oil's great. Meanwhile, the rest of us having to buy oxygen cans to live.
Exactly.
Nailed it.
Yes, you got it.
Join us next time. I was about to say next week, but who knows when we'll record episode 4 of Women in Tropes and Games. But
eventually.
I hope it's soon. I like this series a lot. But you can find our show on Twitter at bestgamesperiod. And we also have a Patreon. If you enjoyed listening to the program, please consider throwing us $1 or more per month. We'd really appreciate it, and that goes to help us grabbing some coffees for ourselves, as well as making the show better. And you get access to exclusive content. Usually Women in Tropes and Games, at least how I conceived it initially. I'm not even sure if this is true. But the series was initially considered as an exclusive for our Patreon backers, and over time, all of the episodes have been made public. And this one will be public as well, just because it's been a year since we put out an episode. But yes, we just appreciate everyone who helps our show out. Retweet, leave us a review, comment, all that good stuff. We will be listening, and hopefully we will be back next week live. We haven't done a live show in a while now, due to my computer trouble, but I will have finally figured the streaming out again. I ran into some problems downloading the software again, because I bought a lifetime-long license to use XSplit, and gosh darn it, I'm going to use that until that company goes under. So once I download that, everything should be hunky-dory. But until then, we will see you next week. Naomi?
Yes.
Thank you for coming on. I missed you so much.
I missed you too. I'll be back.
Please don't make it another year.
Okay.
And on that note, good night, everybody, and we'll see you on the flippity dippity.